So welcome everyone to this session. You are, as you probably know, in the middle of the En route to COP26 event. In this particular event, we're titling Catalysing Immediate Action in Sustainable Urban Mobility. And so do current opportunities help us deliver results sooner than we thought? So I think it's a pretty exciting time to be talking about this, given what we've seen in urban mobility over the last several months during the pandemic. I think there's a lot of new action that's happened around rapid changes in sustainable urban mobility. And so we want to use this session to talk about those, provide some case studies, and see if we can find some resources to help people build on that success going forward. So if we go to the next slide. So I'm the moderator. My name is Andrew Salzberg. I run public policy at a group called Transit App, but I've been involved in transport decarbonization in a variety of roles over the last 15 years. If you go to the next slide. Just some basic housekeeping. In the current mode, we're in webinar mode. You actually can't turn your microphone on, but later on in the session, we're going to have some breakout sessions where you will be able to. In that place, it's best to keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking. You can feel free to turn on your camera throughout the session. You can use the raise hand function during the Q&A when that's available, or you can leave messages in the chat box. So we have a real live interpretation right now. So we have at least one presentation that will be in Spanish, and obviously many that will be in English. And so if you need translation in either direction, you can download the app that's listed there on the first bullet point. Once you open the application, you'll need a code to get into this session. That's the EZCSOB code you see in the third bullet point there. And then you'll be able to follow the instructions on this slide or in the app to be able to have real-time translation. So that's available if you need it, and these are the instructions. So I'll just leave it there for another 10 seconds for folks who want to be able to find it. And if we go to the next slide, those are also available in English if you're looking for translation on the Spanish side. So same idea, you can download the app, use the code, select the language you need, and you can both keep your audio speakers on your computer running in the native language that's being spoken, and you can hear the translation through headphones on your phone. Okay, so that's available if you need it, and we're excited to have that available for everybody who finds that easier to use. So, just to remind people where we are in the middle of this En route to COP26 event, transport emissions, as we all know, continue to rise, even as we need them to be falling rapidly. And so we're working across this entire event to think about how do we transition rapidly to a zero carbon world. And that is something that is running throughout all the sessions. So if you go to the next slide, you can see we're almost literally precisely in the middle of this event, which is exciting. And again, our event is on sustainable urban mobility and the current moment and what that current moment might provide us in terms of opportunities to move a little quicker than we might have thought possible. So if you go to the next slide. So we have a few objectives for this speaking session today. We want to highlight the critical opportunities to spur green and equitable recovery through sustainable low carbon urban mobility. Again, like I said, changed and modified by what we've seen over the last few months. We want to talk about how we can empower national and local policymakers to take action on opportunities by emphasizing the role of enabling frameworks like NDCs and sustainable urban mobility plans. We want to inform the participants, you guys who are on this call, of the available tools and resources. And we want to be sharing detailed case studies. And last but certainly not least, we want to be identifying through crowdsourcing lots of practical near-term actions that can transform urban mobility. And we're doing that through a few ways, but obviously one of them is going to be the breakout session where we're identifying new opportunities that we've seen come up. If you go to the last slide. So like I said, there are several pieces of this overall session. We're going to try and keep it punchy and short. We know 2.5 hours is a long time to be on a Zoom. There's lots of Zooms happening, but we're going to break it up into pieces that I think each one's going to be engaging in its own right. So starting with enabling frameworks as our first segment, and then going down into some global case studies on around transforming urban mobility. Segment 3, we're going to have a breakout room that's going to be into smaller groups, enabling us to kind of work collaboratively, and we'll explain that when we get to that time. And last but not least, we're going to have a closing panel to reflect on what we've learned over the last couple of hours. And throughout, I would invite you, as you see on the bottom of every slide, feel free to tweet with the hashtag En route to COP26, just to let other people know what's happening in this session and keep the awareness of the overall program going. Go to the next slide. So yeah, like I mentioned, I think these are the goals that we're aiming for, right? This the resource guide that we want to put together as part of this session, crowdsourced throughout what we're working on over the course of the day, some key policy recommendations, including short and long-term actions, and finally, kind of continuing to identify the needs of practitioners and decision makers around these topics on sustainable urban mobility. So without further ado, I want to introduce Lise Bray to make our introductory remarks. She's the head of mobility and transport division at the Agence France de Développement. So Lise, if you're on, you can take it over from me.
Yes, good afternoon, good evening for some of them, good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for allowing me to set the scene for this exciting session. Well, as Andrew said, we are now 5 years after COP21, where very ambitious goals were endorsed by the states and the Committee of Transport stakeholders, and also in the middle of this serious crisis. So I understand that the question that we ask today is, and how can we now use the resources and networks and knowledge that we have to accelerate transition to zero carbon transport? So I would like to say two things. First, let me first emphasize why urban mobility is so important in this transition, because in this en route to COP26, I mean, urban mobility is amongst other topics of transport. It is important because, of course, transport emissions are rising, but because in particular, cities represent today 50% of all transport emission. And this is growing because urbanization is growing. And it is also important, and that is very important to me, because it is not only about GHG emissions, but about having livable cities with acceptable air quality, without hours of traffic congestion, with the possibility to go to your job, to the university or to the market safely and in an acceptable time. And it's quite important and interesting that for urban mobility, there is really a convergence of objective between these local objectives for the inhabitants and the global objective of climate. First. Second, I would like to set the scenes regarding what are the different frameworks that we have for urban mobility planning. I think we have a consensus around three things. First, one analytical framework, which is avoid, shift, improve analytical framework. I don't know whether this is familiar to the audience or not, but in very short, it is the idea of combining long-term, short-term actions regarding in order to avoid motorized trip, long motorized trip, in order to shift to low carbon modes, whether this is mass transit or, for instance, non-motorized mode, in order to improve the energy efficiency of fuels and vehicles. And in order to do that, we need to work on the framework, the enabling frameworks, governance and finance. So this one analytical framework is important, we should have in mind, and there is consensus about it. I think there is also a consensus on the tool that we have, which are the SUMP for Sustainable Urban Mobility Plans. These are plans that help sharing a vision of the city. Where are we now? Where do we want to be in 10 years? They help providing a diagnosis to identify the main flows. And that's very important because you may realize that work is dominant in most of the African cities. And this is not always clear when you are discussing with a mayor. So putting some figures showing that walking is dominant, showing that paratransit is also a very dominant mode is quite important in the diagnostic. These SEMs help also organizing the dialogue between stakeholders. And this is not always easy. Here we are amongst us, among practitioners of transport, and we are all convinced that we should drop the idea of car centers development for cities. But this is not the case when you discuss with a mayor of, I don't know, a city in Turkey, in Morocco, or anywhere, because the decision that must be taken sometimes are difficult because space is a limiting factor and car is still very much a social privilege. So I think that SUMP are something more than just planning, just studies. There are a participative process where you really put the ideas, the options, the scenarios around the table and see what do we do. And they help aligning on a holistic vision and the whole range of requested measures. And I insist on the fact that within this range measures, there are some investment, of course, but there is a lot of policy requirements on financing, on national regulation, on fuels, etc. So I'm very proud that AFD is a founding member of the Mobilizer City Partnership, which is supporting a number of cities and countries in developing and promoting SUMPs across the world. So an analytical framework, avoid, shift, improve, a tool, I think that is now quite robust with a strong methodology, which is SUMP. And the last point that I'd like to make is that this is still not sufficient in order to be effective in planning low carbon mobility. We need also to work at national level. This is an important message I'd like to convey, is that the cities, they operate within some frameworks that are legal frameworks, financial frameworks that are usually set at the national level. So this requires not only to have local planning, low carbon local planning, but also a number of supporting programs at national level. And the link between national and local is very crucial and key if we want to be effective. So just in few words, I think we have resources, methodologies, quite a lot of experiences now that has been shared, that shall be shared amongst us in order for us to find here what are the short-term, long-term, medium-term measures to tackle the objective of this zero emission transport. Thank you.
Thank you, Lise. So I want to introduce Britta. Britta Gross is the Managing Director for Mobility at the Rocky Mountain Institute, and she's going to come on to introduce our first segment and our first panel. So Britta, if you're there, you want to take over from me?
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. This is the first segment here of this session. In this session, we are going to identify the enabling frameworks, the tools, and the resources that are available today to catalyze action on sustainable urban mobility. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. There is a lot of opportunity this year from COVID-19, as we all know, to re-envision our transportation systems. So we wanted to kick off this particular session by doing a speed round of some of the available tools and resources to help leverage these current opportunities to make progress on decarbonizing transportation. We are compiling all of these tools and resources into a resource manual that we will share with all participants. And in addition to those that you'll hear about today, we've also begun to collect a number of additional resources that won't be presented, but will be included in the resource manual. And the thing we want to do today is we'd like to do a little bit of crowdsourcing with all of you. If you know of additional resources and tools that are available that aren't mentioned today, and that these tools can help with any and all aspects of urban mobility planning, implementation, et cetera, then you're invited to please add these resources to the document, which you should find in a Google spreadsheet that should be shared in the chat room here shortly. We thank you in advance for all those contributions that you make to the document. It'll just make a more robust, versatile, and usable document for everybody around the globe. Joining me today are 4 global experts on urban mobility. First, we have Emily Hozek, who is responsible for knowledge analysis and policy advocacy at SLOCAT, which is the Partnership on Sustainable Low Carbon Transport and an international stakeholder group. We also have Philip Turner, the head of sustainable development at UITP, the International Association of Public Transport. We have Michael Engelskirchen, the coordinator of urban mobility for the GIZ and Euroclima program, and Sasank Vamuri, also with GIZ, and the coordinator of the Mobilize Your City Partnership, which is an alliance of international partners dedicated to sustainable urban mobility. So let's get right to it and go through a few very short presentations of some of the tools and resources we can use to help drive local, national, and coordinated actions to help us realize low carbon and sustainable urban mobility. Emily, can you please start us off by describing SLOCAT's resources?
Sure, thank you so much, Britta. And as Britta mentioned, the idea behind this is really for all of us to come together as different organizations working on transport and put all of our tools and resources in the same place, because there's lots of different meetings, there's lots of different organizations that you're always connecting with. So the idea is to try to have one central place where you can go if you're really looking to raise transport ambition in decarbonizing transport. So I'm from SLOCAT, as Britta mentioned, and the first resource that I wanted to share is our list of 10 recommendations for raising transport ambition within nationally determined contributions of the Paris Agreement. So as many of you know, countries are in the process of updating their nationally determined contributions, and including transport goals within those contributions is extremely important. And so SLOCAT, along with GIZ, ITDP, and WRI, and with the contribution of a number of other partners, have come up with a list of 10 different specific policy recommendations, to include transport ambition in NDCs. So we have the list of 10 shown here, and we have supporting case studies from different countries, as well as resources. If you just head to the link shown here on the slide. And we also have everything available in Spanish, and we will soon have everything available in French. So if you or someone you know is currently working on updating your country's NDC, this is a great place to start for transport ambition. So next slide, please. So along these same lines, SLOCAT, together with GIZ's Advancing Transport Climate Strategies, has been developing an NDC transport database to actually see the new ambition coming in the updated NDCs. So it's really assessing what that role looks like across all NDCs that are being turned in. And the database really looks specifically at target setting, adaptation and resilience, and then the different subsectors included covered for transport. So it's a work in progress database as the NDCs keep trickling in, and everything is available on this link here. And we also will have an interactive online database coming in early 2021. So this is good to kind of see what other countries are up to, and kind of the level of global ambition that's happening in transport. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. So a lot of our session, we're kind of talking about all these opportunities that have arisen from COVID-19. So I just wanted to alert everyone to this resource that SLOCAT has, where we've just compiled everything that we can find, articles, opinion pieces, webinars, et cetera, on COVID-19's impact on sustainable transport. So we have resources for all of these different subsectors. So, and it's continuously updated. So it's just a good central location, and it links to lots of other databases, because I know lots of other ones exist. So again, trying to centralize a bit. But it's a good place to go if you're looking at, how to best leverage opportunities from COVID-19 to improve transport systems. And then finally, I just wanted to mention, SLOCAT has a kind of a flagship report that covers all of the global trends in transport and climate change across all global regions, looking at different targets and measures that different countries are taking, and global best practices in transport decarbonization. And we're working on finishing that up this year, and it will be out, the newest version will be out next year in March 2021. You can access the 2018 version on our site here, but it's a really good central place to go, again, to see everything related to the current status of transport and climate change, and where we're at, and where the gaps are that we need to raise ambition on. So that is it for SLOCAT's contributions. I think we will next be going to Philip from UITP. Philip Turner.
Yep.
The floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So I just wanted to provide just a very quick summary on some of the resources and tools available for transport city authorities that we've developed that can be used to help enhance the SUMP process. So here, this is based around the European model, which UITP supported the development of, which is really focused on 4 key areas. And I think some of the policy and knowledge briefs that we've developed highlight some policy recommendations and best practice case studies on how to support implementation around these 4 key areas. So the first real area is around the planning phase, about how to do this. I think one of the key areas here is about the issue of governance, and specifically I think about managing the transition with new mobility providers. And so some of the recommendations and case studies we have here about how to develop joint business models with new players, but also some of the regulatory responses and how to go about that. The next real phase is around the strategy development, as has already been mentioned. So having that clear vision based on a backbone of a sustainable transport system, public transport, walking and cycling. But I think it's important, the need to consider not just transport issues, but the wider sustainability picture. So how to include considerations such as health and integrate that within this wider sort of context. Going round, there is the need to move from that planning phase to the practicalities of delivery. Obviously, here there are the challenges around finance. I think we're all fully aware of that. And what opportunities are there? So we've got recommendations about land value capture, for instance, but also best practices in terms of organizational restructuring about how to meet the different customer demands and how to go about doing that. And then finally, lastly, it's around the implementation and monitoring of that. And this really is a crucial last step about ensuring that vision is delivered. So here we have a focus on how to monitor customer satisfaction of strategies, looking at key indicators around the Sustainable Development Goal framework to ensure that practical delivery of management, but also ensuring how to ensure a safe public transport network, because I think that's obviously critical right now, and looking at really the policy recommendations and practical methods to ensure a safe system, because then that can encourage greater use. But that was just a very quick highlight from our side about what was available to support the resources and to support implementation. So thank you.
Hey, thank you. If we could go perhaps to Michael from GIZ, Michael Engelskirchen.
Yes, thanks, Britta. I would like to briefly present two tools we are currently developing. One is the toolkits on low carbon transport. We understood from our experience in cooperation with the countries, with the cities, that access to knowledge and know-how tool is an important factor in changing transport. And with those toolkits, we make this knowledge from GIZ and other organizations accessible and actionable to practitioners and decision makers. We have developed a set of, for now, 5 toolkits on transparency, MRV, eco-driving, bus fleet renewal, and on the national urban mobility policies and investment programs and the sustainable mobility plan, so the NUMPs and the SUMPs, and these are, I mean, of particular relevance for this session. And both of them has been launched today, so hot off the press with a set of valuable tools. They are developed by practitioners, for practitioners, so really practical use in any project, any activities you're implementing. They provide a structured guidance, general information, but also really specific expertise if you need particular information on certain steps in the development of your projects. The toolkit, it's not a once-off activity, so it's designed to be a dynamic tool. We are adding tools, but also, I mean, even more important, you're invited to give us your feedback and contact us whenever you have any questions or comments or tools to add. And I mean, actually, that session here, the resource guide we are developing throughout the session is also very much in line with that idea of sharing knowledge. And the other tool I would like to present on the next slide is our regional community of practice on urban mobility for Latin America, which is an integral part of the Euroclima Plus project, and another great example how we could capitalize the waste knowledge and experience in the transport sector. because solutions are there, and I mean, not just copying it, but adapting it, and there's a lot of useful information around. And we have discovered when designing the Euroclimate Plus program that there are a lot of similar challenges in the region. And we would like to share the experience we make in the Euroclimate Plus projects, in the NUMPs and the SUMPs, but also experience from other actors, from other cities and countries, to share this in this larger community. And we are offering, I mean, it's not only an online platform, but there's a lot of presential activities. We are organizing workshops, networking events, but also, I mean, at these times this year, I mean, of course, the focus was much more on the online events, webinars and e-learning. And also important element is this social platform, sharing news, facilitating discussion in working groups on specific topics, and enabling a peer exchange, virtual peer exchange in this case, among the actors on the region. Please get engaged. There's a link provided in the chat and on the slide. It's focusing on Latin America, but not limited to actors in Latin America. So if you're interested to share your knowledge and to learn about what's happening in the region, please join. And it's also linked to the global community of Mobilizer City, where Sank will present in a minute. Thanks.
Thank you, Michelle, for handing over. I think you made Britta's job a little bit easier and my job as well. So you mentioned the broader community. So Mobilizer City is a global partnership where we have AFD and GIZ as the main implementing partners, supported by the French and German environment ministries and the European Union. So at the moment, we have 60 partner cities across the world, 42 of which are receiving technical assistance in 14 partner countries, 12 of which are receiving technical assistance. And that's just a bit of context to say how we formulate these tools. So I'll present 2 tools and 1 resource, but maybe just a quick 10 seconds on the process. So because we have all of this implementation experience, we're able to sort of do kind of an inductive process of using experience to formulate guidelines, processes, approaches, sharing lessons learned that can be applied to other places. And then as we kind of learn from that, we evolve and adapt our tools as well. So this is actually the launch of our National Urban Mobility Policies and Investment Program guidelines. So this is available on the Mobilizer City platform, developed by UEMI, GIZ, AFD, again, with the rest of the Mobilizer City implementing partners, to support national governments and doing what Lise mentioned in her opening remarks, creating this enabling framework for cities to address mobility, encouraging sustainable mobility at the city level. So there has to be this kind of interaction, interplay between the national and local level. And these are guidelines to help national governments identify the most valuable opportunities to support their cities. Next slide, please. I liked how when Slowcat Emily presented, she had 10 policy recommendations, and I was thinking, actually, you know, we're working on 4 of those, and this is the one that is about tools using ASI and making sure that we are being rigorous in our approach to mitigation approaches. So we have the Mobilizer City Emissions Calculator, again, developed with AFD, GIZ, in this case also EFOI, a research institution that helps cities and national governments assess both the current emissions from road and rail transport in their cities, project or build different scenarios for what could those emissions look like under various sort of scenarios, and then model what we call, you know, a climate scenario or a NUMP or SUMP scenario. So once a country or a city has chosen a specific type of policy approach with a selection of projects, what could the emissions be like in the future? And we think this is really important because it helps both support cities and countries, or supports countries in quantifying their NDCs, support cities in contributing to the national dialogues, and also ensures that we're really doing what we hope to be doing, which is to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. So this resource is also available with the tool itself, user manuals, video tutorials, and lots of other supporting materials on our knowledge platform. And that takes me to my last slide, is the Mobilizer City knowledge platform. So as with everything else, so this is a collaboration. I'm just the talking head. The work is really done by all of the great people at GIZ, AFD, Wuppertal Institute, and our other organizations. But we try to have one place that sort of compiles a lot of this information specifically related to these topics of mobility planning, NUMPs and SUMPs, like Lisa mentioned, but also the work that we're doing on the emissions calculator and linking to finance. So check this out for more resources, and you're also more than welcome to make a profile and share the information that you have directly onto the knowledge platform itself. Thank you. Britta, it's back to you, but I can also, can I introduce the next video?
Could you please, Sasank?
Yes, I'm so sorry, yeah. So all of this kind of maybe sounds like a little bit abstract. We flipped through like a bunch of slides. We've talked about mobility planning, SUMPs, NUMPs. I don't know if acronyms that are familiar for everybody, but we thought maybe we could show a very brief video of what it looks like when some of these tools are used in action. So we have a short couple-minute video from Santo Domingo, from the executive director of the National Transport Institute, who's presenting an AFD-supported sustainable urban mobility plan and how that's helped their city. So maybe the video can play. Thank you.
El programa Mobilize Your City se introduce en la República Dominicana a través del Ministerio de la Presidencia. En ese momento estábamos haciendo los trabajos que tenían que ver con el plan de movilidad urbana y a través de la Agencia Francesa de Desarrollo conocimos del programa e inmediatamente pues quisimos inscribirnos y participar para poder obtener los beneficios de dicho programa. El país decidió convertirse en socio beneficiario de este proyecto de Mobilize Your City porque buscábamos una metodología que nos garantizara obtener un plan de movilidad urbana sostenible que estableciera unos tiempos a corto, mediano y largo plazo. Además, a través de este programa, pues podemos accesar a fondos para la implementación de este mismo plan. De igual manera, la implementación de este plan nos ayuda a disminuir los niveles de emisiones de gases, pero también nos ayuda a planificar la continuidad del crecimiento de la ciudad de una manera más sostenible. La iniciativa Mobilize Your City se compromete con tu ciudad. ¿De qué manera? Pues se realizan una serie de talleres, de vistas públicas, donde participa toda la ciudadanía, donde participan las alcaldías, donde participan los principales actores. Y esta la consideramos como una herramienta sumamente importante porque garantiza la inclusión, pero además la permanencia de planes como estos. Decidimos implementar el Plan de Movilidad Urbana Sostenible, PEMUS, como tradicionalmente se le llama, siguiendo los pasos establecidos por Mobilize Your City, porque nos gustó la parte de que las alcaldías se introducen en toda esta propuesta. Esto te garantiza que las necesidades de los territorios pues sean parte del plan. Se establece una serie de pasos que garantiza la medición del avance del plan en su implementación y lo más importante es que este plan es desarrollado por una compañía o por una institución de vasta experiencia en la creación y la preparación de planes de movilidad urbana sostenible. ¿Por qué recomendaríamos a algunos países de Latinoamérica ser socios beneficiarios de este programa Mobilize Your City? Si son ciudades como la nuestra, aquí en República Dominicana, el Gran Santo Domingo, donde manejamos altos niveles de congestión, donde tenemos altas tasas de personas fallecidas por siniestros de tránsito y también personas lesionadas, y donde los niveles de contaminación realmente nos afectan. Si este es el caso, estamos obligados como autoridades a trabajar por ciudades sostenibles, ciudades que garanticen a nuestros ciudadanos calidad de vida. Los planes que se generan a través de programas como Mobilize Your City nos trazan un horizonte, pero también nos permiten ciudades más vivibles, garantizando calidad de vida a nuestras nuevas generaciones.
Hey, thank you everybody for watching that video. Hope you caught the subtitles on that in English if you needed that. With that, I want to just send another last reminder to please, if you have knowledge of tools, resources, frameworks, helpful information that would help cities, local governments, federal governments, state governments, et cetera, make progress in the area of urban mobility, please feel free during the course of this entire session to enter any of these resources into that Google shared worksheet that we've put into the chat room. And so with that, I think I want to hand it back to Andrew to move us to the next session.
Hi, I think we're going to actually have Mark introduce himself in the next session. Is Mark on? Can pass the baton.
Yep. Good afternoon, all. It's my pleasure to moderate this second short segment. My name is Mark Major, and I'm the Senior Advisor with the SlowCap Partnership. And it's my pleasure we're going to have in this segment, we're going to have a quick look at 4 case studies from around the world. And that's going to be case studies from Africa, case studies from Latin America and Europe. And so without further ado, I would like to invite Frederick Strompen, who is a mobility advisor for the mayor to Cologne in Germany. Frederick is not only active in Cologne, he's active on social media, promoting discussion of these topics. So I'm very grateful for that. So I'd like to invite you, Frederick, to please tell us about what you're seeing as opportunities for rapid transformation of urban mobility from your work in Cologne.
Right. Thank you, Mark, for having me. I will share my screen. I hope that works. Are you guys already able to see it?
Yep, I think we can. Yep.
Great. Perfect. Let me just full screen. Right. Thanks. Thanks for having me. Like Mark said, I'm Frederick. I'm advising the mayor of Cologne, Henriette Reker, on transport policy. She's just got re-elected for another 5 years, so it's pretty exciting times to work on sustainability and transport topics, which was a major part of the last election. But I want to directly jump into the topic, which is the role of the pandemic and future outlook on decarbonization. I think a question that many cities are asking themselves at the moment is basically whether the pandemic is accelerating existing trends, whether it's really a chance for speeding up decarbonization, or maybe it's also a comeback for the car, right? I don't think we are safe to say yet, but I want to discuss the topic a little bit. Before I jump into it, I would briefly introduce what is the city of Cologne, what was the impact of the pandemic on urban transport, and then just jump a bit into what are the measures that we already took and what do we want to do in the next year. So Cologne is a fairly big city for German standards. It's the 4th largest city with 1 million people, but to really understand the transport system in Cologne, I think it's quite important to understand that we're in the middle of a metropolitan region with 10 million people, very interconnected, very close to each other. So commuting is a big topic. 500,000 people move in and out Cologne every day. We are very well connected through the river, through a train network. So we are very, transport is really a key topic in Cologne. Also because the car industry is quite big in Cologne, with Toyota and Ford having large industry here in Cologne. And to understand how the pandemic influenced the mobility pattern, I think it's quite important to understand where do we come from. Cologne was really rebuilt as a car-friendly city after the Second World War. During the Second World War, Cologne was basically completely destroyed and then rebuilt with the planning goal to make your trip with the car as convenient, as accessible as possible. So the outcome is that we have major road arterials throughout the city with ring roads, 4, 5, 6 lane ring roads through the city and around the city. So that is really a sort of historic burden we have for transport planners now. So what happened during the pandemic is, I think, also a bit of a result of that. In March and April, where really the soft lockdown, I'll get back to that now, just started, we have seen that the overall demand for transport, of course, basically collapsed. We had for private vehicles, we had a reduction of 30%, public transport even as much as 80%, and bicycle trips went down by 50%. Again, March, April, looking at here. And this of course is quite a dramatic reduction of trips, which is especially problematic for public transport. We'll come to that now. But I think it's also important to understand we didn't really have a hard lockdown in Germany. It was mostly you know, putting some restrictions on social interactions and leisure activities. Now, car trips just went down by 30% in March and April, and you'll see here recovered very quickly. When public transport went down by 80% in March, and only slowly, but you know, not even surely, but just slowly recovered, the car trips were already back in June. So we can see that the convenience of being in your car, etc., really led to a resilient transport mode, which is of course worrisome for us as a transport planner. But two developments are especially dramatic for us. One is public transport in Germany is mostly funded by farebox revenue. So 75% of the operational cost of public transport is covered by farebox revenue. That means with that 80% dip, we really have a huge hole in our budgets, which for the largest operator, for example, has 7 million euros more deficit, and then at the same time last year, just for April. And now looking forward, that is quite important, because what we need to avoid is that we get into the spiral of, okay, less demand, we reduce investments, then we reduce quality, demand gets further reduced, right? So that is really something we have to break out, and we have to be creative on how to get out of this. And I jump into this in a sec. What was really amazing was the comeback of cycling, and especially from April on, we had such a huge increase in cycling trips. These are the automated cycling trip measure stations. I'm sure there's a more elegant way to say this, but so we compared the trips made from January to November 2019 to 2020, and we have got a 40% increased average trips made along these routes. Of course, this is not an increase in modal split just in these routes, but still it gives you a picture on how important and how resilient cycling was over the course of the pandemic. And we did a couple of things to support this. So we didn't go as far, for example, the city of Berlin, for example, to put up completely new bike lanes. What we did is we increased resources and increased priority of existing plans. So when you look, for example, at this example, on the left side is an intersection. Well, it's the same intersection on both pictures, but on the left side, you can see the heritage of a car-friendly city. The planning of intersection was done in such a way that the goal was to make cars turn as fast as possible. So you had these right turns. And we've got more than 500 in the city of these. So what we did is we developed this year, we developed a toolbox to implement fast measures to improve safety for cycling at these intersections. And one tool in this toolbox is just putting up bars like here, just lock down the road for cars so that only cyclists can turn, which has led to a huge increase in cycling using that intersection. So that is I think, quite an important but easy to implement measure that we did. Another quite important measure is that we are in the process of transforming the major road arterials in the city to cycling-friendly infrastructure. Here you can see a 3-lane road, the ring road in the city. It's around 12 kilometers, I think. And we transformed this into, we took away 2 lanes and gave it to cyclists and a mixed use for cycling, parking, loading, etc. So this again, it was not a completely new measure, but we sped up the implementation this year to account for the increase of cyclists. What we also did is we took away quite a number of parking spots. For example, just in the inner city center, we took away more than 150 parking spots, and yeah, we put up some trees. We put up some bike parking just to give more space to pedestrians and cyclists. And we have seen that by communicating these goals, by saying, well, we want to give more space for pedestrians because, you know, it's just the right thing to do at the moment, to not to be close to each other, which might come more natural to Germans. But to communicate this publicly was led to a high acceptance of these measures, despite the fact that we reduced quite a number of parking lots. Now, I hope you can see that. Right, so coming to my last slide, I just wanted to highlight that, or coming back to the first question, is whether we really are in a catalyzation of decarbonization. I wouldn't say yes at this stage. I know that it's not very satisfactory, but I think if we want this to happen, we have quite a job to do. And here are the things that I think we should prioritize. And number one, I think we will have to look at a new funding framework for public transport to make it more resilient and to get out of that quality degradation spiral. So we teamed up with other cities to look into new funding sources beyond farebox revenue. So that is quite a big task, but I think this pandemic has shown us more than ever that we need to have a more solid funding of public transport. And then, of course, cycling will be a priority for the next coming years to ensure that we sustain the trend of cycling. I mean, the increase that we have this year is really fantastic and something we couldn't really foresee. And so it's really now our job to make sure that we keep the people on the bikes. Another, I think, quite obvious strategy is to improve multimodality, to convince people to get back out of their car now. And we need to show that there are resilient and reliable options. And for that reason, we developed a mobility hub standard, and we will roll it out citywide next year. And my last point here is that even at the beginning of the pandemic, we could already see that last mile logistics, and as a result of e-commerce growth, has really been present in the city. So that will be a major task for us to account for the increase of e-commerce growth, because one thesis that we put up is that we won't go back to where we were before the pandemic in terms of amount of last mile delivery. I think that's quite safe to say. So we will next year implement a couple of city logistics hubs where we consolidate supply chains and then allow for last mile delivery with zero emission vehicles. Now, the pandemic, as bad as it really is, came at an interesting time strategically for us, because we just started in sustainable urban mobility plan in Cologne. Actually, we just jump into the work next year with all consultants being hired and everything. So all of these developments will feed into this process, because now we have a couple of new priorities. We saw that we have a high public acceptance for the things that we do, even if they're just small measures of locking off streets and things like that. So for us, for our SUMP process, we already said, well, let's not wait until that is done, but let's continue implementing small measures while we are developing the SUMP. I think that is a quite an important job for us to do. Yeah, that was in a nutshell what happened the last couple of months in Cologne, and what we were planning to do to really make this pandemic also an opportunity for sustainability.
Thank you very much, Frederick. Thank you very much indeed. That was a really clear overview of the dramatic impact on mode share, and the impact that means on revenue. But also, I'm struck by how pragmatic a lot of the response measures that you've come up with. I mean, kind of simple, kind of pragmatic things. That's very impressive. So thank you very much. Please share the tool you mentioned into the Google Sheet, so other people can take advantage of that. That will be great. And also, I recommend everyone listening in to follow Frederick Strompen on Twitter for really pragmatic kind of takes on his work. But time is tight, so we should move straight on. We're now going to turn to Latin America, and I'd like to introduce Lorena Saavedra, who works with the German Development Corporation, GIZ, on national and local projects in Ecuador. Lorena, can you share with us what opportunities you see from your work for transforming urban mobility?
Great, thank you, Mark. Well, I'm gonna share with you the case of the community of practice on urban sustainable mobility that was created in the country this year, and that has been really active for tackling together the upcoming challenges of low carbon mobility. So in that sense, just as background information, really short, try to explain where were we in the transition towards sustainable urban mobility before the pandemic. So since this was a difficult transition, but it was something that was already being discussed throughout the world. Some cities, the three biggest cities of the country, had already given baby steps, but were isolated efforts, particular initiatives here and there, pilot projects, but nothing really integrated as part of cross topics in urban mobility plans. And definitely they were not acting as triggers to real transition towards urban mobility whatsoever. So they were not trying to make this a stepping stone they can build on later on. So they were trying to prove it here and there. And in the most recent efforts were a couple of projects that we as Euroclimate have been supporting. One of them is the National Policy on Urban Mobility that is under development, and also the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan in Ambato, which is an intermediate and was trying to be a demonstration action for other cities to replicate, and also to show how they can coordinate between the national level and the local level, and just a few memberships that some cities of the country have been signing to the Mobilizer City Alliance as a first step towards urban sustainable mobility. But there was a huge blind spot there that was governance and multi-scale coordination, because that's something that no one talked about as something that needed to change. But whenever you had a workshop or something before the pandemic, it was already chaotic as it is in the transport situation we are, even before trying to transition to something else. So that's something I want to mention, because that's where we see most changed after the pandemic. So just briefly, the timeline, the community of practice and how it has worked. It started in January. Before the pandemic, we supported the idea that since we had some 5 members of Mobilizer City already, that we could create a short network where they could exchange experience. So we had a first encounter. Not only the 5 members came, but also other municipalities that wanted to collaborate, and they started discussing initial ideas on how to collaborate and identifying topics where there would be a match between someone that had experience and someone that had the need to work on that topic. So it was a really productive encounter, and it was really promising. But then the pandemic hit, and that was something like a good idea, but something really ethereal at that moment, became really important, and it was crucial to have this space that they regather and they start rethinking the community of practice, not in the long term of how do we want to shape the community of practice in the long term now in the pandemic, but they kind of put in standby the identified topics they had discussed in January, and they came together and say, now we have really crucial, common, urgent challenges we need to face and we need help. So they discussed on that, and it was also really interesting how the participation of the national level changed, because in the first encounter, they were kind of an observer there, but in the second one, they discovered that it was an active challenge to communicate between the national and local level. And the national level realized that they have a really protective space where they could actually coordinate with municipalities how was going to be the response to COVID. Because in Ecuador, the de-escalating of the lockdown was decentralized to the subnational level. So the National Ministry of Transport actually had to coordinate a lot of things with municipalities into how to organize that and how to ensure, for instance, food supply chains and so on and so forth. So it was really, really interesting to see this shift. And then, of course, in May, we have the growth of that community of practice and the possibility to have discussions. We created like discussions with experts on 4 prioritized topics that they identified as key issues they needed to face in the moment. And so where they can ask, what do I do about this, or where I'm seeing exactly this problem at this moment, how do we tackle it? So we create that, and now we're in a phase where they are enhancing that collaboration. The last encounter was like to to start sharing experiences of how everyone is doing, already implementing the solutions they have been discussing in the past few months. So it's really interesting because they have been really active. It's difficult to try to portray really what has been going on unless you have been part of that process. It's not really easy to evidence how effective it has been, but the key findings that I want to try to share with you is the fact that it became a wider network. It's not only the municipalities, it's not only the Mobilizer city members, but now, since given the context, national government has participated, international cooperation agencies, development banks, and associations. So now it's a great space for coordination, and everyone kind of understood that we were in such an emergency situation that we needed, we cannot waste any cent, and that we cannot duplicate actions. So that we had to be really strategic and act together. And also, of course, the fact, and this is something just trying to answer the topic question for the session, it's interesting how whenever you have need, that triggers immediate executions and enable political will without foreseeing whether you really agree with other scale of government or with other sibling city or so on and so forth. And then this national local level dialogue was probably the biggest takeaway, because beforehand, one of the governance issues that we had identified is that all the municipalities said that the national level did not know the local context, and that there were no active channels of participation to collaborate on those. And the national level itself, they said that they didn't know, for instance, how freight transport operated between cities, that was something that was really complex for them to understand. And now, given the pandemics, they have discovered possibilities, and they have discussed and they have found these channels for consultation, coordination, and feedback. And of course, and also just like the previous presentation, the other thing that has changed is also the key issues. Beforehand, it was all about like, how do we improve public transport, because that was the way to go in order to shift towards urban sustainable mobility. But in this pandemic, non-motorized transport, cycling, walking had become a really main issue, because the citizens have shown more interest in those transport modes that the authorities had foreseen. So there was always the discussions whether the private car would be always in the center of the planning of the urban mobility in the cities. But now they see that cycling is an opportunity, that people are willing to do it. Most of the cities in Ecuador had de facto cycling paths implemented, and they are trying to move forward to make them permanent, and they are trying to find new opportunities in light e-mobility solutions, and of course, new business models and new financing possibilities for enhancing public transport, but totally under a new light, and as a complementary solution to non-motorized transport. So those are the key findings of this community of practice. They have to think now how they are going to be moving forward and what their role is going to be in enhancing the transition in the upcoming years. But I think it has been a really collaborative experience, and it's really interesting case to see how multi-scale coordination can take place and can be the stepping stone to actually trigger a transition to a low carbon transport.
Thank you very much, Lorena. That's great for taking us through what you've been doing, what's been happening in Ecuador, and for packaging so nicely the key findings for us. I take really clearly that you see this in lots of countries. You have some urban examples, some pilot projects, interesting things happening in different places. But how do you take that to nationwide scale so that it's happening everywhere? So that's one important message. Also, this idea that the political opportunity changes with the circumstances, and this year opened up some political opportunities to do some new things rapidly that we also saw in the Cologne case. So thank you very much. We're now going to move on to Africa, and I'd like to introduce Charlene Gaussi. She's with the African Mobility Observatory in the Ivory Coast. Charlene, welcome. And can you tell us about what opportunities you see right now?
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thanks to Kat also for bringing this international panel. Yeah, I would say that for many actors in the African continent, COVID-19 has been an opportunity as they realize how vulnerable their way of operating is to economic shocks or crises like we've experienced. And they had to adapt rapidly to social distancing, mobile money, also contactless solution, mobility avoidance as well. So just for you to know, Côte d'Ivoire is one of the most dynamic countries in West Africa, but all areas of economy, politics, administration are mainly centered in the capital city, Abidjan, which is one of the problems today and since a couple of years, especially when we talk about mobility. And the ones who better seize these opportunities are startups and the private sector, who develop teleworking pretty rapidly, contactless solutions, click and collect, other logistics services to respect the sanitary measures. So to stop the spread of the virus, the state and the public institutions were quite efficient and acted rapidly with the help of the private sector, notably, but social and economic governance and management of the crisis was not a success, and especially as far as the informal sector is concerned, which is part of, which is the core of the transport system in Côte d'Ivoire, the informal sector, which represents at least 83% of the transport offer. And it was left behind and barely managed to cope with the situation. The bus and local taxi fleets were insufficient to meet the demand of mobility, and no resources were allocated to face the urgent need of mobility for people who had actually to work, to move around the city, and especially when the reduction of the seats in the vehicles were reduced. So I would say that even though the crisis has passed in Ivory Coast, the offer has not been really adapted to the current situation and the future crisis that may come. Since the commitments for now to decarbonize transport have been made for 2021, 2025 and beyond, with the arrival of notably 2,000 clean buses by the actual transport company here, with the metro project also, which is expected to be there in 2025, the BRT as well, the bus rapid transit. So very interesting projects going on in Côte d'Ivoire, but which unfortunately have been delayed by the crisis and the presidential election that occurred last month. So because the pandemic has emphasized the vulnerability of the system, and also the need for a common and inclusive strategy towards sustainable mobility, the Ministry of Transport announced a few days ago that the budget of the ministry would be raised by 21% in 2020 to absorb the negative impacts of the COVID-19, especially in investing 78% of this budget in key projects like I said, the light rail, but also the rehabilitation and modernization of 5 airports in the country, also the professionalization also of the sector, because as I said, it's mainly informal. And also focus on mobility and intelligent traffic management in Abidjan, and road safety, of course. So the Ministry of the Environment as well as also take actions in this, and announced some some projects as well by 2020 towards decarbonation of transport. And among this project, the roadmap for sustainable mobility is also a project that is supposed to raise the NDCs of Côte d'Ivoire. So with Climate Change, the association Climate Change, PPMC as well, the Ivorian Ministry of Transport, supported by Michelin Foundation, we've started to work on a roadmap for sustainable mobility in Côte d'Ivoire that will guide decision makers to build stronger policies and also more inclusive policies, but also to facilitate financing projects towards sustainable mobility. So all of these projects demonstrate the extent of the work that needs to be done here, and to be continued to meet the commitments made to the people, to the nation, and to the world as well in terms of climate change. So I think that non-state actors and the private sector have a big role in achieving these goals and to bring this dynamic of change, because unfortunately the public sector is fully aware of what's to be done, but it's not really able to adapt its administration system, its governance, and its way of managing project, or at least not fast enough, even in times like this, to do so. So this is what I think, and what Côte d'Ivoire and other African countries should do. Just to conclude, it's to define the appropriate decarbonation strategy and trajectory, for the territories, as the North Africa, South Africa, East Africa, all parts of Africa are different. So we first need to define this strategy, then to develop a new and inclusive low carbon transport service, and to conclude, support and assist regions and governments in terms of technical and financial support. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Felini, for explaining that so clearly. And I really see that the mixture of kind of current immediate challenges and the longer term projects you're trying to work on getting delayed in the current circumstances, that comes across really clearly, as well as the budgetary impacts that we also heard about from Cologne. And like in the Ecuador case, this importance of multi-level actors at the state, regional, link up. So thank you very much for that. And now we come to our last case study. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Paula Visca, who is an economist and consultant with the Ministry of Housing, Land Planning, Environment in Uruguay, working at the national level. Paula, please share with us your experiences. I think you're going to speak in Spanish, is that right?
Yes, thank you, Mark. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. I was given the opportunity to speak in Spanish, and so I will take it, if it's okay with everybody.
Go ahead. Translation is organized.
Okay. Bueno, muchas gracias nuevamente por esta invitación. Yo quería compartir brevemente nuestra experiencia en nuestra política de movilidad urbana sostenible que estamos elaborando y desarrollando en Uruguay desde hace 2 años aproximadamente. Comenzamos en este proyecto. Bueno, tenemos la próxima. Gracias. Esta es una foto, o sea, sobre todo me pidieron compartir el proceso participativo y de articulación que tiene este proceso en Uruguay, que se caracteriza justamente por una fuerte coordinación interinstitucional. Aquí muestro una foto del evento participativo que tuvimos hace 2 meses para obtener insumos para nuestra política en elaboración, que bueno, fue un evento, se pueden ver que las personas tienen mascarilla, porque en Uruguay tenemos una buena, es uno de los, creo que de los países que ha tenido menos casos de COVID en el mundo, y lo hemos hasta ahora mantenido bastante bajo control, entonces se podían hacer actividades presenciales, y este taller muestra que hubo amplia participación a pesar de las medidas sanitarias para obtener insumos para esta política. La siguiente. Bueno, nosotros tenemos, quiero mostrar primero los actores que están participando de esta. Next one, please, Mark. Thank you. El liderazgo de este proceso, además del Ministerio de Ambiente, participan. Hola. Bueno, sigo. Participa el Ministerio de Industria y Energía, el Ministerio de Vivienda y Ordenamiento Territorial, que ahora está separado del Ministerio de Ambiente. Son dos ministerios, a partir de este año se separaron, y Ambiente tiene un ministerio propio. El Ministerio de Economía y Finanzas y el Ministerio de Transporte y Obras Públicas. Además, este proyecto, como decía, tiene el apoyo de Euroclima a través de GIZ, y otro actor importantísimo que no está en esta slide, pero que es fundamental, son los gobiernos locales. Los gobiernos locales tienen un papel muy importante para, como decíamos, implementar las acciones que surjan de esta política. Antes de entrar en detalle en esta transparencia, en Uruguay los gobiernos locales tienen autonomía para la movilidad urbana, entonces es necesario involucrarlos desde el principio, y nosotros hemos hecho un gran esfuerzo en este proyecto y en este proceso para tener un diálogo con los gobiernos locales. Entonces trabajamos como a dos niveles: a un nivel nacional con los ministerios que mencioné anteriormente, y a un nivel, digamos, de diálogo con los gobiernos departamentales, para que ellos puedan también ir apropiándose de este proceso para luego poder generar sus propios planes locales. Entonces, bueno, el marco que tenemos please Mark, not yet, thank you. El marco que tenemos en términos ambientales que nos guía para este proceso es tanto la Política Nacional de Cambio Climático, que da un marco estratégico nacional con una visión a 2050, la primera NDC, que fue presentada en 2017, actualizada con respecto a la INDC. Tenemos un plan nacional ambiental, estamos elaborando la estrategia de largo plazo, también está alineado con los reportes de ODS, que es un proceso que el país ha venido llevando adelante, y una estrategia de desarrollo nacional que también se ha estado elaborando. Desde el punto de vista energético tenemos instrumentos como la política energética, la ley de uso eficiente de la energía, una ley de agrocombustibles y una ley de eficiencia energética. Luego también desde el punto de vista territorial tenemos instrumentos de ordenamiento territorial, como son las leyes y directrices de ordenamiento territorial, y también avances en una estrategia de ciudades sostenibles. También aspectos de seguridad en el tránsito. Todo esto, digamos, da el marco para que podamos avanzar, digamos, fuertemente en este proceso, y que dé ciertas garantías de que está alineado a otras políticas nacionales y no es un proceso aislado. Next one, please.
Paula, tenemos que ir un poco más rápido, por favor. No
Sí.
tenemos...
Ok. Algunas de las actividades que se hicieron respecto a movilidad en el país, y esto es importante desde el punto de vista de la coordinación. Tenemos un grupo interinstitucional en eficiencia energética en transporte que funciona desde el año 2014, donde los ministerios que mencioné, gobiernos departamentales, la empresa eléctrica y la empresa de combustibles en el país participan, y eso ha dado también un marco institucional muy fuerte para que esto avance. Además de la política, bueno, tenemos proyectos de cooperación que apoyan, generación de datos, la empresa eléctrica y pilotos. La empresa eléctrica ha colaborado también y participa muy activamente con la infraestructura, y el sector privado también se ha involucrado para facilitar la movilidad eléctrica en particular. Y luego tenemos temas regulatorios como impuestos, subsidio a los ómnibus eléctricos y otros instrumentos. Next one. Este es el proceso que muestra, esta imagen está en español porque era una imagen, lo que venimos haciendo desde hace 2 años. No me voy a detener en esto, es nuestro proceso del NUMP, ya que tengo muy poco tiempo. La idea es que nuestra política tenga el año que viene. Luego de estas instancias participativas, que algunas mencioné, hemos tenido después de septiembre otros talleres participativos en donde hemos avanzado en los contenidos de la política para luego tener un documento, digamos, socializado y participativo, que sea aceptado también por la ciudadanía, porque acá hay un componente de cambio cultural muy importante. Y en Uruguay, digamos, estas cuestiones se tratan de hacer de forma participativa y coordinada con instituciones, como les decía. Y bueno, tenemos el proceso de tener inputs y luego un documento y validarlo el año que viene. Next one. También tenemos otros elementos en el proyecto, además de apoyo al proceso de la política de movilidad urbana sostenible. Tenemos guías técnicas para la planificación de la movilidad urbana sostenible, que está en elaboración. También para una guía para la electromovilidad que puedan implementar las ciudades. También inputs para mecanismos financieros que puedan financiar estas medidas, y bueno, y también digamos un componente de fortalecimiento de capacidades que es transversal a todos estos componentes, tanto en educación de niños, de jóvenes, en la universidad, gobiernos y ciudadanía, y a nivel de gobierno tanto nacional como subnacional también, o sea, que las capacidades abarquen a todos los ámbitos.
Perdona, realmente no tenemos mucho más tiempo. ¿Puedes pasar a tus conclusiones, por favor?
Sí, ya estoy terminando. Next one.
Perdona.
Sí, el proceso participativo cuenta con sector privado, sector público, academia y sociedad civil. Todas estas personas participan de este proceso que les venía contando. I think I have 2 more. Las dimensiones de la política son ambiental, social, económica y también habilitante. Estas son las dimensiones que queremos abordar en la política, que sea una política integral de movilidad urbana sostenible. Y finalmente, the last one, de las instancias participativas hemos tenido inputs para la visión a 2050 de la política, objetivos de mediano y largo plazo, y medidas de movilidad urbana sostenible. El ámbito de acción obviamente son las ciudades, la movilidad de personas y carga, y bueno, y como decía siempre, en coordinación el nivel nacional y subnacional. Bueno, creo que terminó ahí. Muchas gracias.
Wonderful. Sorry to rush you, Paula. That was super interesting. In many of these sessions, I'm struck by how local the circumstances are and how local the solutions are. But so many things that you said there about your work in Uruguay are kind of universal. This need for a process for the stakeholder engagement. This is something that takes time. This challenge of policy and institutional coordination. Yeah, so really useful messages that are valid everywhere. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to thank all of those 4 case study participants for sharing. and a lot we can learn from that. And then with that, I close segment 2 and pass the word back to Andrew, who's going to introduce segment 3. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. So this is segment 3. It's a chance for you in the audience to participate in the overall session. So we are going to try something bold and go into breakout groups. So if we look in the chat, we should be placing a link that will be coming soon that you have to click on to get into a separate Zoom that will allow us to be in breakout sessions. And so what we're going to do there is break into small groups, depending on the size of what we have, and go through 3 questions using a collaborative tool that will be explained when you get to the sessions. That's going to let you input your ideas on these 3 questions. So hang on for 1 minute. That link is now in the chat. So we're going to have 3 questions that each group's going to go through. So we're going to talk about what is required from a national public policy perspective to spur the kind of actions we've been talking about around decarbonizing urban mobility. We're going to talk a little bit from the bottom-up perspective, what's required at the local level, and then more broadly, what else do we need to actually make these kinds of transitions happen at the scale and speed that we need them to. So I think now is a good time to go to the side of your chat, and there's a link that Emily just posted that you should all be able to see. And if you click on that link, you will be passed into a new Zoom. And when you're there, you'll also be able to introduce this new tool called Easy Retro, which is very simple to use. That's going to let you collaborate with people in your breakout groups to actually be able to contribute. So hopefully that is working. I can't see right now how the panelist count is going, but if you go over to the right, you should be able to click, and that should take you into a new Zoom. So now I'm just going to wait for the magic to happen when that transition actually takes place. So hopefully that's where I see the numbers are going down, which is good. That's a sign you guys are leaving this webinar Zoom, which doesn't let us do breakout sessions, and heading over to the new one. So sorry for the extra step, but I think it's worth it for the effort to actually get together and see everybody's faces and be able to collaborate a little bit and break up this session. Okay, so I hear people are aligned, which is great. So if you're still here listening to me talk, that means you should probably be clicking on the link to the right and heading over to the different room. So we'll give folks a couple of minutes to do that before we kick off the working groups. And if you'd like, you can get started early. And there's another link there for the Easy Retro board. That's the whiteboard app that we're going to be using during the breakout session. So if you want to get extra credit and get there a little early, you can open that up too. But the most important one is to get over to the Zooms where we can enable the breakouts.
Okay, people are gradually coming back in. Welcome back into the plenary session. We just see that people are gradually coming back in. We hoped you enjoyed that opportunity to work for us for free, to crowdsource these solutions. Okay, and just to conclude this kind of short breakout session, I'm going to try and give kind of like an overview. We're really grateful for you to contributing here. All this information, this crowdsourced perspective, is going to be included in the session report that will be available after en route. Of course, we'll be able to tidy up and merge things that are the same, giving it a little bit more clarity, maybe perfecting a little bit of the language to make sure it's clear. But what we saw is, I saw 2 things. I saw 2 horizontal kind of thoughts. One is I saw a number of things that are generally true over time, that are established things about the need for awareness or space for sustainable modes or prioritization or financing. So things that are generally true. I saw another category which were really specific to this year and things that we've seen working this year, like these temporary measures and the need to make the ones that are working permanent, to make those temporary COVID response measures permanent. In the national public policy, I thought this idea of a national citizens charter was a great idea, a national citizens charter for urban mobility. That got quite a few votes. Something that came up in the 3 columns was this need for coordination and discussion. So discussion forums with stakeholders, coordination, but also this formal coordination of national and local levels, like we heard about in the Ivory Coast case in the earlier session. in the local one, we have this question about, this question of vision and awareness, which I thought is kind of, they're very linked. You need a vision, and you need people to be aware of low carbon solutions and their importance and the benefits. So that came through very strongly. Maybe not surprisingly, in the other category, what's missing, we had this question of financial instruments, frameworks that are clear and attract public and private finance. Yeah, so I think those are rather the brief overview that I take from this exercise, but it just shows the value of bringing almost 100 people with different perspectives, different parts of the world together to work together on crowdsourcing solutions. So with that, I thank you again for your contributions. We're also very grateful for your contributions to the resource guide. We're getting more and more things in the Google Sheet. So I hand it back to you, Andrew. Thank you.
Hey, Mark, thanks for wrapping up. Sounds like it was a great session in the breakout groups. So we have our closing panel that is coming up. So it's just my interlude to take the baton from Mark and then pass it back to him, I think, ultimately, if you're moderating that final session. So this is our last session of the day. So we're glad to have you back from the breakout sessions and looking forward to what's happening. So Mark, I think it's back to you to handle this last group of esteemed panelists. So I will.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm very happy to do so. So now we have the chance for a little bit more of an interactive discussion. And it's a real pleasure for me to moderate this panel. If you guys can put on your videos, please, that's great. At first, I'd like to invite Sheila Gabukayan Napalang from the Department of Transportation in the Philippines. She's the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Project Development. And I would invite her to, based on the things, the case studies you've been listening to, I'm sure you're observing that crowdsourcing exercise, but also particularly based on what you're seeing at home. What do you really want to underline as the main opportunities to accelerate action on urban transformation?
Oh, thank you, Mark. Good evening from the Philippines. It's already 10. Yeah, it's 11 p.m. in the Philippines right now. But thank you for inviting me to this forum. Let me just give a background of the Philippine Urban Mobility Program that the Philippines has. Now, the department has worked with Transfer and Mobilize Your City on the Philippine Urban Mobility since 2017. This was approved in December of 2019. I'd like to just say that our vision for the PUMP is the Towards People First Cities, empowered by efficient, dignified, and sustainable mobility. If you've been to the Philippines, you would know that our public transport system leaves a lot to be desired, but we're really trying to move forward on that one. So I'm just going to say that tragic this pandemic may have been, it has actually provided opportunities for the Philippines to accelerate some of the things that it wants to do. Like, for instance, one of the targets for our Philippine Urban Mobility Program is to increase modal share of public transportation. Now, we all know that one barrier in the Philippines is the reliability of public transportation. But the pandemic, because we reduced the load factor and therefore the drivers and operators do not get as much fare revenues. So the government stepped in through a law called the Bayanihan 2, which offers what we call a performance-based subsidy. So something that the Philippines has been wanting to do through the law, through this particular funding, we are now implementing service contracting. For those of you who are familiar with this, service contracting is actually a means of, providing payment to operators based on a vehicle kilometer, performance. Therefore, this shifts the the passenger based, which is very, very dangerous in the in the Philippines, because if your drivers get paid by based on a passenger basis, what that happens is that they exhibit really dangerous maneuvers. They move from inner lanes to outer lanes in a jiffy just so that they can pick up passengers. But more than that, the service contracting is seen to also increase reliability of transport system. So I think, this one has been an opportunity for the Philippines. Another one is one of the barriers is, of course, the long travel time because of the long waiting time. Also, the pandemic has facilitated the implementation of EDSA busway. It's we call it BRT-like. We've been, if anybody who's studied the Philippines would know that since 2010, we've been wanting to implement the bus rapid transit, but it has been long delayed. But because of the pandemic, we have this BRT-like, it's EDSA busway, which now has a dedicated bus lane and cuts travel time to maybe 50% than what it used to be. So, because of that, we've actually been able to do that. And, another thing that this has, facilitated is it has also facilitated the consolidation of routes. The Public Utility Vehicle Modernization Program of the Philippines has been in place since 2016, but it has suffered delay for so many reasons. I'm not going to go into, because I only have 5 minutes, even less than that. But but the PUVMP has been seriously delayed. But because of the pandemic, and I'm not saying the pandemic is good, but it has given us an opportunity to actually maximize our public transportation, right? So we've been able to rationalize from 96 bus routes to 31 bus routes with only 2 operators, managing it. So this means that it's less competition, right? Less competition among the operators, and it's also easier for the government it's more tractable in terms of regulation. Okay. Another opportunity that this crisis has provided is, I'd anchor it on another target that's found in the Philippine Urban Mobility Plan program, which is increasing the kilometers of protected bike lanes, right? Again, as in any other country, the use of active transport, walking and cycling has actually been markedly improved because people consider this to be one of the safest way to travel. You're not traveling with anybody else, right? So in the Philippines, I don't know how many kilometers of protected bikeways we have right now, but because of this pandemic and the Bayanihan law, we are now set to construct 432.64 kilometers of protected bikeways. So, and also legislators have come on board because it's now, it's everybody is into walking and cycling. So we have legislators have filed bills in Senate that are supportive of active transport. Now, we've also seen the pandemic show potential for decreasing GHG emissions per passenger, which is another target in the Philippine Urban Mobility Program. According to the data from Clean Air Asia, during the enhanced community quarantine, it was a complete lockdown in the Philippines. Emission was reduced from the transport sector, was reduced by 54%. Great, right? But it has now, because now we're more relaxed now, it has actually gone back to almost pre-pandemic levels in terms of increase in terms of GHG emissions. I'm just going to stop there because I'm not sure if I used up my 5 minutes already.
Thank you very much. So I understood that you were saying that you saw in the Senate, in the Philippine Senate, increased support for like walking and cycling this year.
Yes.
That's really very interesting. Do you think that's something that's going to help you longer term? Do you reckon that's going to be maintained? That kind of
precisely. Yeah. Well, we're hoping. Well, because the bicycle facilities are infrastructure, so it's not easy to like dismantle them. You've got 400 kilometers. That's pretty good start. What I think the challenge would have to be to sustain the gains that have been started here during the pandemic. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So thank you for being with us so late in your evening. I'd now like to invite Mr. Bharat Salotra to join the conversation. You're co-chair of the Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry's Sustainable Mobility Council. You're also the managing director of RUMAS India. What are you seeing from your, I guess, more corporate perspective as the opportunities?
Yes, so thanks, Mark, and delighted to get this opportunity to speak at the en route to COP26. So actually for us, the COVID pandemic has demonstrated two important lessons. Firstly, it has shown us the power of exponentials, but it has also demonstrated to us how nation states and corporations and research institutions can all work together and get galvanized into unprecedented action, hitherto not experienced by any of us in our lifetimes. So even as the world urbanizes at a frenetic pace, a similar power of exponentials seems to manifest itself through the twin challenges of congestion and poor air quality in our cities. And particularly for countries like India, which is really at the cusp of urban transportation, where the expectation is that by 2030, another 200 million people are likely to move from the countryside into India's already super congested and highly polluted cities. And so as India aspires to achieve the $5 trillion economy mark, our cities, which contribute almost 70% of the national GDP, need to be retrofitted, redesigned, and revamped. The time to actually to catalyze the change is right now. As we have seen, the COVID pandemic has really affected the way we live our lives. Working from home is now pretty much a standard norm rather than an exception. Social distancing is being mandated across human settlements, and new travel restrictions have been imposed in public transport systems. On the other hand, cities have had to very quickly assemble, revised protocols for public transport and contactless ticketing. But on the other hand, we also noticed that private transport has tended to become a preferred mode of travel, which is quite unfortunate. But as a way to, and the way we've handled the challenge is that as a way to decongest and also to dissuade use of private transport particularly for first and last mile connectivity, several public-private partnership-led non-motorized transport schemes, including bicycles and zero-emission vehicles, have been launched. And the current crisis in public transport actually has offered a very fertile ground for several new startups to offer green energy-based seamless mobility and also interoperability solutions, particularly in the B2B segment. And several of these rely on developing new, the state-of-the-art intelligent transport systems that qualitatively enhance the customer's offerings. Going forward, I think these initiatives also underscore the need for a fundamental rethink. Urban mobility needs a paradigm shift from building infrastructure to move vehicles to building infrastructure to move people. And that's one of the comments which I made in the earlier breakout session. Because for far too long, our cities have focused on building more roads, more flyovers, and more parking lots. I think it is now high time we invest on developing infrastructure with a clear focus on moving people and goods and on developing pedestrian pathways, implementing zero emission zones. But for that to happen, and this is again I mentioned in the breakout session, we need to rebuild our governance structures that take an integrated, holistic view to urban mobility instead of a siloed unimodal approach. As we have also recommended in our sustainable mobility roadmap, it is imperative that we established a well-empowered, unified urban transport authority at the city level that is driven by a well-defined citizens charter for sustainable mobility. And the citizens charter needs to be established at the national, state, as well as at the city level. And that's the way the authority needs to be directed. The efforts of the authority, of the transport authority, should be to procure land, raise and allocate resources among competing modes, and plan and offer mobility solution in an optimized, ecologically and economically sustainable manner. The current crisis has, of course, underscored the importance of rapid transit-oriented development. It has given a dramatic fillip to e-commerce and delivery at the doorstep. But more importantly, it has also brought into sharp focus the urgency to quickly adopt renewable sources of energy for our mobility systems. In the last few years, as a promoter of International Solar Alliance, India has substantially demonstrated how green energy can be generated using solar and wind power at economical rates. And as a result of economies of scale and scope, and with the latest technology evolution, the prices of renewables have shown a sharp decline. And in fact, just a few days ago, we just witnessed the lowest ever price offering for solar power at levels far below the grid parity. The expansion of green energy generation through renewable resources has also opened up immense possibilities for exploring hydrogen economy. And to that end, the government of India has actually recently established a standing committee for adoption of green hydrogen-based economy, as well as fuel cell-based transport for our city buses. With sharply reducing electrolyzers as well as fuel cell costs, we could be at a dramatic inflection point that redefines urban mobility based on green hydrogen.
Okay.
Having said all this, and I'll just conclude, the fact remains that implementing sustainable mobility solution requires a very deliberate, citizen-centric and a mission-driven approach based on collaboration across multiple stakeholders. We cannot look at urban mobility in isolation. We need to look at the importance of multimodal logistic parks, surface and bus ports, and all that is paramount. And in these two areas as well, we have seen major initiatives being rolled out. Thanks once again for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. I mean, many of us working on this topic know how important the work what's happening in India is for the global climate. That's very clear. So many people are. So it's encouraging for you here to say that you see unprecedented action happening in India. Do you see this like a change in political attitudes at the higher political levels, like we heard from the Philippines? Do you see politicians being more supportive?
I think so. You know, the politicians also have to live in the same context that all of us live. I mean, they have to breathe the same air, and they have to tolerate and bear with the same levels of congestion. So I see a tremendous push for using energy, renewable sources energy for green mobility, and several new initiatives have been taken. I mean, India is one of probably the second or the third largest adopter of electric buses. Globally, and I think that move is on. But as I said, hydrogen seems to be a very, very interesting place for a country which has a lot of sun, a lot of wind, and a lot of potential, waste to energy opportunities. And so that opens up immense possibilities. And really, there's all the politics put aside. I think everyone wants this to happen.
Great to hear you being so optimistic about a number of things. That's really encouraging to hear. So I'm going to try and come back to you both. I'd also now like to introduce into the conversation Oliver Lahr, who is based at the Equitable Institute in Germany, but is working very globally on these topics. So Oliver, can you kind of respond a little bit to what you've been hearing today and how this connects with what you've seen in your work?
Great, thanks, Mark, and thanks for the wonderful discussions so far. Has been quite a stretch, a lot of things to digest. So summarizing any of this will not do justice to the depth of the discussions that we had, but maybe picking up a few of those themes that we discussed. So one of which, of course, was on the coordination between the local and the national level. And there, of course, the frameworks that we touched upon, the SUMPs and the NUMPs, are quite helpful. But what that means in a very practical sense is linking local action that of course relies quite a bit on the national policy framework with regard to the regulations. So vehicles that we develop in our urban living labs, for example, that we run through the Solutions Plus program, for example, they need to be allowed on the road, right? Otherwise, it's great innovation, but it will not contribute. So regulation is usually happening then on the national level of these kinds of vehicles. And then, of course, a big rollout of services needs quite a bit of investment. We do talk about bankable projects a lot, but there's also lots of funding and financing around in the sector domestically. So the generation through fuel tax, through differentiated vehicle taxations, but also allowing cities to raise road user charges, parking charges, all of which allow us to raise funding that can then be reinvested. All of this needs to be very open and transparent in as much as participation as we can enable, so that it becomes clear that we pay more here, but we see a direct benefit there. And always this direct benefit is at the local and city level. So those two are inherently interlinked. The big bucks at the national level where we can raise funding and where we can then invest and people can enjoy the benefits of those. Maybe I just stop here.
Yeah, and we've heard some positive messages from the two from India and Philippines, also from Cologne and to a certain extent Ecuador. Overall, do you think this current COVID situation is going to help us accelerate some of these transitions you're talking about? Accelerate? I mean, what do you think?
Exactly. I mean, one wonderful example from my home country, for example, a conservative-led federal government that decided against a measure that it has taken during the financial crisis 10 years ago, giving perks to people buying cars, conventionally fueled cars. That's what they did back then. They decided against it and only gave perks to, incentives for electric vehicles. We are not quite there yet at the level of, well, actually, we should also differentiate there. And an electric SUV, for example, is not a good car. An electric scooter, for example, would be a good vehicle. So we are not quite there at that level yet, but you see change happening. What happens, what to a certain extent is also enabled through us not being able to travel anywhere in our daily project work, is this co-development that we're doing between industry players and startups and local authorities on a very practical and pragmatic project level. This happens actually very nicely now with us being in virtual rooms and sharing those ideas. There will be a long stretch for sure, and there are windows of opportunities that easily evaporate very quickly, but there's some glimmer of hope, I would say.
Okay, very good. Also, some optimism from you then. So there's a number of questions coming in the chat. There's a question for Sheila about opposition that you might have faced with the consolidation of the bus routes in the Philippines. So I'll come back to you on that in a minute. There's also a question about how indeed we see different lobbies fighting for their vision of the future. Is that electric SUVs? Is that hydrogen vehicles? Is that electric bikes? How do institutions, very good question, how do institutions keep a balance in their approach when you have such strong lobbies pushing for certain solutions? So I'd now like to invite Sasank to join in the conversation. Thank you for being so patient, Sasank. So you already had the chance to speak at the beginning of this session. What have you been thinking while you've been listening to these discussions?
It's been great. I was also thinking a little bit specifically on the question about are the opportunities leading to increased pace, right? So the kind of just to kind of think implicitly the opportunities that were mentioned by everybody here. Obviously, the coronavirus situation, as much as it is a global pandemic, it's offering us an opportunity. We're seeing the awareness of the role of transport in climate change mitigation. So Transport Day was one day, now we're having 3 days. If it wasn't for coronavirus, we probably would still be talking about Fridays for Future and civil society. I mean, Bharat mentions as well, like citizens, companies are also saying that we have to take action on climate change. I mean, this is an opportunity. The financing infrastructure is reorienting itself. I mean, the EIB is an example we had earlier this one, they're aligning lending with climate orientation. So this is also an opportunity. The coordination that Oliver mentioned is an opportunity that's helping us pick up the pace a little bit. Electric vehicles, clearly, and as Bharat mentioned, also the cost of producing renewable energies to charge those electric vehicles. I mean, so that's clearly an opportunity. So just to say, like, what I was thinking is just, I mean, that was sort of one thing that struck me is this kind of whole range of different opportunities. So, I mean, maybe it was framed in the context of coronavirus, but I think it's a bit maybe broader than that. But it also made me realize, I mean, so Mobilize Your City is now 5 years old. We were launched at COP21. In the 5 years, not everything has been accelerating action. There's certainly like some things that are slowing down action, you know? And some of these same things that are opportunities have had some challenging effects. And maybe I can just highlight like a couple of those issues. So for one is really like the data. I mean, so it's difficult to get the right data to do rigorous planning. And when we have the data, we're seeing maybe there were some issues that we didn't consider quite as effectively before. So it was mentioned in the session earlier on today, the role of paratransit service providers in a lot of African countries, a lot of Asian countries, for example. If we want to do mitigation, we need to bring them into the loop. So in one of our cities, there are 70 formal buses, but 700, so 10-fold informal buses, right? And so if you want to decarbonize the transport system where 80% of the people are relying on these bus transportation systems, then we need financial access, we need a whole different system to get those buses. So that's, I think, one kind of area that I think has been challenging, and coronavirus is making the data collection really challenging to enable making the right policy decisions. No, I mean, I think people are doing the best that they can, but of course it's hard to do the data collection to do that. And the second is financing. I mean, as much as we're kind of seeing an increase in financing, a reorientation of financing, there's also competition for funds. I mean, where does recovery funds go? And then the second element is also the financial viability of public transport projects. I mean, just to mention that as much as, you know, at least international banks and some of the other private banks want to align with the Paris Agreement, there's certainly a competition for funds. And at the moment when, you know, even cities like Cologne and New York are running billions of dollars in deficit in the public transportation, it's a little bit harder to make it work even in places like the Philippines. So lots of good opportunities, but a couple of things that are definitely slowing us down.
Okay, thank you very much, Sasank. So I'd like to come back to you each in turn, so you have the chance to kind of react to what other people have said. And I'd like to come back to you first, Sheila. Particularly, can you just answer this question from the chat? I mean, did you get a lot of opposition to this consolidation of the bus routes and the operators? And that's probably need 2 hours to answer that question.
No, but strangely, everybody is in a different state of mind because of the pandemic. And so everybody wants to help out. So strangely enough, that's why I said this pandemic has actually provided an opportunity. Something that has been difficult to do for the longest time suddenly became not very easy, but facilitated because everybody knew how difficult the situation is. It was not as hard as we thought it would be.
Wow, that's great. That's great to hear.
It's not easy. It's not easy, but but not as hard. Again, because we had reduced load factor for our public transportation. We cut it down to 50%. So that would mean that your revenues would also go down by 50%. And so therefore, everybody just wanted to make sure that we're still able to run public transport when we open after the lockdown. So I think that's what facilitated it, because everybody just wanted to help because it was such a difficult situation.
Wonderful. That's a great. So thank you very much. Bharat, what do you think about this question about different lobbies fighting strongly for their solution? It's electric SUVs, it's hydrogen trains. How do you think public policy needs to keep a balanced perspective?
So Mark, you know, India is such a huge country. The size of the pie is so huge. We rarely have a situation where CNG is fighting against, you know, electric is fighting against hydrogen, because we have the capacity and the capability to actually absorb all of that simultaneously. So, you know, different levels of technology, different types of vehicles, all that is happening. Some great things that have happened is like the scrappage policy has just been released a little while ago. There is a strong push towards intermodality, multimodal, new logistics parks is being set up, as I mentioned. So we don't have that challenge that several other countries have. And just for you all to know, I mean, the average, India has just 1.6 to 1.8 buses per 1,000 people. So in the state, in just the state where I am, in the state of Delhi, I could potentially have another 10,000, 15,000 buses and still feel short of buses. And one of the reasons why we have so much of private transport is because we don't have adequate public transport. I mean, there's just a lot of focus. So we don't have the challenge on the lobby space.
That's a great message to hear, and not all of us have the chance to work in somewhere of such incredible scale, a scale which is sometimes hard to grasp for us that live in much smaller countries. So thank you for that. Oliver,
invite and welcome all of you to India.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oliver, what would you, final remarks, final comment from you, and then Sasank, please.
Great, thanks. Well, then let me pick up the lobby question slightly from a different, but also, you know, eventually positive perspective. So, I mean, the key thing here in this sector is that the key players are producing something that is a product, a car, right? And this is quite different from the electricity sector, where they only produce electricity, and they can change from one way of producing it to another and still make a business out of it. From the mobility side, this is quite a different story. It's harder to see Volkswagen or Ford producing mobility and not a number of cars. So there are inherent elements in this industry that make this quite a challenging kettle of fish. But it is starting to change, right? Some of the industry players are changing their perspective, and they do understand that we are looking into mobility as a service, not just mobility as cars. So it is changing, but we're at the start of this transition, and it will still take some active dialogue with those players. But we need to engage with them. They are not our enemies; they are our friends in a long journey.
Thank you very much. I mean, from the outside, this industrial policy, political dynamic in Germany is very interesting because, of course, Germany has such a strong car manufacturing sector in certain regions. You want to say something else?
Just wanted to say one tiny thing on the industrial side as well. Is, of course, electric mobility gives us also great opportunity to develop vehicle industries in all other countries as well, in particular on the smaller side of vehicles. Electric 2- and 3-wheelers, minibuses are quite a different story from a conventional car being produced. So startups, small SMEs, companies have a much bigger opportunity there with regard to economic development.
Yeah, but also we're also saying from lots of sources that this mobility transformation is actually going to create more net jobs. I mean, there's certainly challenges in the transformation, but the future is bright in terms of new, better local jobs. So
Exactly.
That's certainly part of this story. Okay, Sasank, what final comment from your side, please?
No, I like the future is bright. I mean, I think we should almost end on that, but maybe just to complement what Oliver said, he was talking a little bit about the supply side. And I think I've been thinking a lot about the demand side for these vehicles and ensuring maybe also that the individuals, the operators, the SMEs that would be potentially purchasing them, it's not just the manufacturing, but also the demand would be generated by the SMEs. And so we have to also think about financial inclusion in the transport sector. I think we have to think, what does leapfrogging mean? Do we get everybody into cars and into electric cars, or do we go straight to the bike lanes? So I think there's a little bit more thinking that we have to do collectively about leapfrogging, and not have that leapfrogging be directly into electric vehicles, but maybe also into, you know, the active modes of transportation, and then also the financial inclusion element to bring in all of the operators, owners of the informal transport service providers into the fold.
So thank you very much. So now we have to draw the panel to a close. Thank you very much to Sank and Oliver for bringing us this perspective. You're working for these kind of multiplier factors, you know, working in multiple countries, bringing things together and analyzing. Thank you very much. But also to our two participants from much further east, Sheila and Bharat, of which given up your evening to be with us. That's really very much appreciated. But these country perspectives are absolutely essential in this discussion. Although we're talking about urban mobility, these national perspectives and corporate perspectives are really essential. So thank you all. Thank you very much. And I pass the floor back to Andrew to close. Thank you.
Final short baton. Thank you, Mark. That was a really great panel. Thanks for all the panelists who were on that. I really enjoyed ending, I think, on a note of optimism. I think not a naive sense of optimism, but grounded in the reality of some of what we've seen recently. So I think that was a really encouraging place to close up the conversation. So all I want to do is thank the session organizers who made this all possible today. So we had Euroclima Plus, we had Mobilizer City, Rocky Mountain Institute, SlowCat, and UITP, all of whom came together to make this possible. And I want to remind everybody that the materials, including the list that was developed in the Google Doc, will be shared from this and all the other sessions and will be online. So we encourage you both to use them and to share them beyond just the event we had today. And if you go to the final slide of this deck, if someone's still there, perfect. You know, just a reminder that I think many of you already know, but we're just in the middle of the overall En route to COP26 event. So I invite you and encourage you to attend other sessions and also to continue to tweet and share on social media using the hashtag En route to COP26, which will help people be aware of what's happening in these great sessions. So thanks everybody for being here. It's been a really great experience, and I'm really happy that we ended with, you know, some cautious notes of optimism that the big, bold goals we have coming out of COP21 are actually possible. So thank you, everybody. And I think we can close there just on time, which is perfect.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Keep safe.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Great
Thank you.
discussion.
Thanks, everyone, for participating.